The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela, Yvan, earlier had an intervention before the UN just minutes ago regarding the coercive measures placed on his country. Let's listen.
Of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations, whose member states, from the very outset, would like to thank you for convening this historic debate on a subject to which they attach particular importance. It has been almost 14 years since the last time the General Assembly held a proper debate on this item, which was the first introduced into the body's agenda back in 1996. The issue of unilateral, coercive and extraterritorial measures was addressed. This was a relevant subject at the time, and it still is today in light of the international circumstances. At the beginning of this statement, I would like to take the floor to call upon the General Assembly to take appropriate measures in order to ensure that, in the light of the application of unilateral, extraterritorial, coercive economic measures ends as quickly as possible. This matter must be addressed much more periodically within our Assembly. Unilateral coercive measures exert economic and financial pressure on any country that is targeted, particularly developing countries. These are illegal measures. They represent a clear violation, among others, of the very tenets enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, of the most basic norms of international law, including the provisions of various texts. I am referring in particular to those texts that cover friendly relations and cooperation among states, the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States as well. This policy of the imposition of unilateral coercive measures has failed. It is one of the most striking examples of this is that of Cuba, which for over 60 years now has been suffering under these measures. We renew our unwavering solidarity here with the people and government of Cuba, while urging once again the government of the United States of America to immediately and unconditionally put an end to this blockade imposed on excluded from the arbitrary and unilateral list of state sponsors of terrorism. Mr. President, the promulgation and application of unilateral coercive measures has no basis under international law. These measures are unjustified and illegal. It is important to be clear in this regard, as nations applying these unilateral coercive measures seek to impose a false narrative on the entire world in order to deliberately confuse and mislead the international community, as they seek to justify and even legitimize such illegal policies. This is unacceptable. In this context, it should also be noted that, different to what some countries pretend to portray, financial transactions or the provision of goods and services necessary for human assistance and basic human needs are in fact affected by the very existence of unilateral coercive measures, including as a result of the fear of so-called secondary sanctions. It is an illusion to believe that these measures do not have an impact. In practice, they have been proven to be ineffective, or rather non-existent. Unilateral coercive measures are very clearly a crime against humanity. They constitute a massive violation of human rights. They deprive entire populations of their very means of subsistence. We cannot allow us to be deceived or convinced otherwise. Mr. President, today, the reality is that 30 countries around the world, including many from our grouping, are directly affected by these unilateral coercive measures that have a daily impact on the lives of over a third of humanity. This reality, needless to say, has created a systemic crisis in the entire system of international relations that not only continues to erode multilateralism, but that also increases uncertainty, instability, mistrust, and tensions around the world. Therefore, they constitute a world problem requiring a global solution, and thus the importance of today's debate. We are currently seeing a new generation of these illegal measures, which are now much more cruel and destructive than ever before. This new generation of so-called, very poorly named sanctions are exploiting the suffering of entire peoples to exert subjugation, domination, and intervention. Development plans of the nations subjected to these so-called sanctions, including for the implementation of the SDG agenda, are currently being hindered due to these measures of subjection and domination imposed on sovereign and independent nations.
We have to say this clearly. It endangers life and the well-being of peoples. At the same time, it creates obstacles to international cooperation and limits states' capacities that are subject to it to be able to invest in technology, foreign technology, necessary services, to address environmental issues, especially. Mr. Chairman, President, against the backdrop of the emergence of a multipolar world, unilateral coercive measures have also become a means of unfair competition in the markets. Reserve currencies are used as weapons of oppression. Sovereign property is arbitrarily blocked or even confiscated. As a result, any country that is more or less dependent on Western markets, technology, and financial assistance, and which may also have reserves in Western jurisdictions, is prone to facing the risk of a complete loss of its assets. With such measures in place, amongst other aims, it's not difficult to imagine the strangling of the global South and the undermining the potential for its dynamic economic development. The ultimate goal is eliminating a competitor and consolidating the position of the developing world as a mere vendor of raw commodities. Whether we see it or not, unilateral coercive measures affect us all, either directly or indirectly. On targeted nations, these measures have a negative impact on the enjoyment and the full realization of human rights, including, among others, the right to development, the right to food and health, the right of everyone to a standard of living adequate for his or her health, medical care, education, necessary social services, as well as procurement of goods and services, financial and technical assistance, technology transfer, and capacity building. At the global level, they are deliberately exacerbating the multifaceted crisis humanity is facing today, including its energy and food security dimensions, while severing supply chains and disrupting the markets. And they will continue not only to negatively impact the global economy as a whole, but they also cause and prolong human suffering around the world. Hence, our call to put an immediate end to all of these illegal measures. Mr. President, it's worth asking, for example, how much could Zimbabwe contribute to alleviating the global food insecurity crisis were it free from the application of unilateral coercive measures? How much could Belarus contribute to alleviating that very same crisis should it be allowed to freely trade its fertilizers? How much could Iran, Russia, or Syria contribute to alleviating the global energy crisis should unilateral coercive measures on them be lifted? And were they able to trade without limits or discrimination of any type on their oil and gas? Wouldn't Venezuela be able to boost cooperation with the Caribbean and others from its region, particularly in the energy field, through programs such as PetroCaribe that provide advantageous compensation mechanisms for the procurement of oil. How much could Cuba, the Democratic Republic of Korea, Eritrea, Mali, Nicaragua, Syria, and all other countries subjected to these illegal regimes contribute to overcoming our common challenges if these so-called sanctions were eliminated and if they could all fully pursue their productive potentials? We have a responsibility historically to building together and making a reality that new and possible world of peace and development for all. It is our responsibility for this generation and future generations, and that's why we're talking about it today. Mr. President, in the absence of the elimination of unilateral coercive measures, and cognizant firsthand of their impediments, among others, on the ability to freely carry out trade and investment among independent and sovereign nations, we express, first and foremost, our commitment to a multilateral system anchored in the Charter of the United Nations. Also, our determination to explore potential ways and means to secure a framework or a flat platform that is truly independent and respectful of international law, a platform that would make it possible for us to carry out financial transactions and payments amongst banks around the world. What we are saying here is we need to identify ways and means to counter, mitigate, and redress the adverse impacts of unilateral coercive measures. This would include through the potential establishment of a safe zone that would be free of unilateral sanctions, a zone in which we can trade and process payments without hazards or arbitrary impediments of a punitive nature, the purpose of which would be to ensure both the well-being of our peoples and the development of our nations. Another possibility would be through the enactment of a concrete roadmap that would allow reduction of dependency on international trade and on national currencies that are prone to being used to implement unilateral coercive measures, or they are used to sustain a particular state's monetary hegemony over the global economy. Similarly, we should also acknowledge the legitimate claims, in accordance with the relevant norms of international law, by the affected states, whether they be affected directly or indirectly. And this is particularly true of states and individuals that are specifically targeted by unilateral coercive measures, for compensation from states imposing such measures for the damages incurred as a consequence of the existence, promulgation, and application of such unlawful measures. Mr. President, allow me now to conclude with 6 messages. First, we would like to express our gratitude to all groups and delegations, regional groups, that will be participating in today's debate. We are grateful for their ongoing solidarity with nations and peoples subjected to the application of unilateral coercive measures, and we are grateful for their continued support to the global cause in favor of the realization of a world free of so-called sanctions. Second, by urging the Secretary of the United Nations to present a report with its relevant findings, following the General Assembly's request to monitor the imposition of unilateral economic measures as a means of political and economic coercion, and its request to study the negative impact of such illegal measures on the affected countries, which would include the impact on trade and development. The role of the Secretariat in raising awareness about this issue, which has global implications, as we said earlier, cannot be overemphasized. Third message. We call on all responsible members of the international community to prevent this reality from being minimized or ignored. This would include within the context of ongoing intergovernmental processes currently underway at the United Nations. If we are truly committed to honoring our pledge of leaving no one behind, then the time has come for us all to redress unilateral coercive measures in a comprehensive and effective manner. That is in the interest of the well-being of we, the peoples of the United Nations. A first step in the right direction would be, for example, the inclusion of this matter in the recently agreed conclusions and recommendations of the 2024 Financing for Development Forum. We trust this will also be the case in the outcome documents of the upcoming Summit of the Future. We can no longer sweep this issue under the rug or shy away from discussing it when it is an issue of an existential nature for millions of people around the world. Fourth message, by firmly calling on all states to refrain from promulgating, recognizing, and/or implementing unilateral coercive measures as a political means. We would include the context of bilateral relations. The purpose of this is, among others, to bring pressure to bear or force sovereign will of another state, including as part of a regime change policy. Fifth, we call on all international organizations and international financial institutions to refrain from recognizing, supporting, implementing, or de facto complying with unilateral coercive measures. And sixth message, we reiterate our firm commitment to sparing no effort in preserving, promoting, and defending the prevalence and validity of the Charter of the United Nations, for which it is necessary, among other things, that unilateral coercive measures be lifted in a complete, immediate, and unconditional manner, so that they do not exist in the world today. Mr. President, if I may now, in my national capacity, I would like to make some additional comments. Mr. President, from at least 2014, the criminal attitude of the government of the United States, working with sectors of the right and the corrupt ultra-right in Latin America, has been working against Venezuela and implementing one of the most aggressive programs against this country in history. It is all about a policy of regime change being imposed on a people which, in building its independence and freedom, has refused to cede to this blackmail and insists on being a master of its own destiny. They have brought about a campaign of maximum pressure to bear on my country, full of legal and financial falsity and lies against our country, criminal laws, executive orders that are harmful, lists of people that are sanctioned, and lists of sanctions specifically against our country. All of this in keeping with this criminal structure put in place, which claims to legitimize and justify an illegal policy of extraterritorial intervention. This is the behavior of a decadent imperial empire to support a weak international system. This systematic, sustained economic terrorism against our country, with more than 930 laws against us applied by the EU, the United States, and satellite countries, has led to the seizure of assets and property of Venezuelan people, they've prevented bank transfers and interrupted, amongst others, the debt payment and interest payments by the Republic. They have prevented the purchase of machinery and other inputs from the international market. They have paralyzed international services, brought pressure to bear to stimulate economic growth of third countries like working with Venezuela, and created obstacles to the import of essential goods and services to guarantee the well-being of the Venezuelan people. Mr. President, these measures, which in modern practice are colonialism, have been led to the collapse of the national economy in Venezuela and led to a multifaceted crisis which is without precedent, which translated into a negative impact of the public and private economy of our country. The promoters of these crimes against humanity have been recognized. I open quote, "We must address this as an agony, a tragedy, which will continue until finally it reaches the end. And if we can do something to accelerate it, we should. But we should do so understanding that this will have an impact on millions of people who are already in difficulty in finding medicine and food. We cannot do this and claim that it will not have an impact. We must take a hard decision. The ends justify the severe punishment. This confession, this is the confession of one of the criminals, William Bronson, representative of the genocidal government of the United States of America. Product of the unilateral coercion of these measures between 2015 and 2022, Venezuela stopped producing 3.2 billion barrels of oil, which is equivalent to some $230 billion. Until 2022, the damage caused to the domestic economy of our country is estimated at $240 billion. That means that the loss caused to Venezuela was greater than the international reserves of all the 11 countries in the rest of Latin America. In short, the coercive unilateral measures against businesses, ships, airplanes, and other Venezuelan assets that we need to add to that the confiscation and seizure of $13 billion in various international banks and multilateral organizations has made Venezuela the 5th country in the world with the most people punished, the 6th country with more companies that are affected, in the 4th state with most ships that have been harmed, and the 3rd country with the most airplanes that are affected by these destructive and criminal measures. To evade their international responsibility given these crimes that were committed, however, financial rules have been imposed on this whole range of unilateral coercive measures that claim to avoid the emission of known licenses. In reality, these licenses, and in some cases, were just a euphemism presented as to cover supposed humanitarian exemptions. This is a mechanism of economic neocolonialism, which establishes conditions for states that are harmed and adjusts them to the political and economic interests of the private corporations and the government of the aggressor state. In short, what we're dealing with here is licenses or concessions to dominate, to administer pain, to deepen and extend the time of the structural ties of dependency economically and financially, sustained by an international system which is unfair and designed, tailor-made to the interests of the North, to undermine the sovereignty and self-determination of peoples. Mr. President, given the application of coercive measures, Venezuela has made significant progress in achieving the SDGs, and with that, there has been optimism and an optimal and timely achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. This progress has been affected, however, by the extortionist policies of the United States and other governments that are subservient to its imperial interests and so-called domination. Today, the recovery of the Venezuelan people is due to its own effort. With dignity and morally, it's claiming its possibility to lift itself beyond the criminal sanctions and to lift off with greater strength and fully exercise its right to development. The blockade against financial transactions in the areas of food, healthcare, education, and public services that have been widespread since 2016 have translated into real restrictions that continue today. They persist. And this is different from what the aggressors would say to international public opinion. And with the support of huge media corporations that are trying to turn our faces away and make us not see this. All of this is part of a policy of maximum cruelty, which is calculated to create as much pain and suffering as possible for all of Venezuelan society. It's truly collective punishment due to which early either earlier or later, the promoters will have to be held accountable before international justice. Now, despite all of their attacks, aggressions, undermining and pillaging, which are reflected in these cruel and inhuman measures, unilateral coercive measures imposed on our country, the government of President Maduro has never set aside what we consider to be most essential, and that is the protection of our people through social investment. Mr. President, unilateral coercive measures have been focused on blocking and confiscating the Venezuelan state's assets abroad through an international financial system and arbitrary tribunals in foreign countries. And this has been done in combination with a strategy of aggression using force or the threat of the use of force, thereby undermining and jeopardizing international law and the provisions of the United Nations Charter. In the case of Venezuela, the so-called sanctions operate as a sort of curtain, a cover or veil to hide the criminal operations of theft and looting of our country's assets. And that's why we see the need and duty here to denounce from this august tribune the attempt of illegally stripping our country of its main assets, which is the seventh largest oil company and this is a company which is indisputably a sovereign patrimony of the Venezuelan people. And here we're referring to the company called Citgo Petroleum Corporation, which is the main asset of Venezuela in the United States and property of the Venezuelan oil state, which has been blocked since 2019 and due to the war operations, the lawfare, as it's called in the United States, by the Delaware Tribunal, with the support of fictitious entities which are only recognized by Washington and supposed Venezuelan representatives, is now very much at risk of being undermined to the benefit of U.S. and Canadian corporations. It's for this reason that in this very room we disassociated ourselves from the election of the president in this General Assembly. They're perpetuating the farce in order to continue with their local agents, continue looting all the assets of our people and our country and beyond. We cannot but mention also the impact of sanctions on the economy and global and regional development. Energy security has been seriously impacted by these measures, and here what we see is the productive capacity of the country with the greatest oil reserves in the world impacted. The coercive program, which is the most fabulous company of solidarity cooperation in our region, was very much attacked vilely, with the only purpose of creating inhuman damage to a dozen of countries that were participating in this program. Mr. President, in opting for sovereignty and the exercise its inalienable right to self-determination, and in opting for our right to freely elect our governance system and economic model that suits us, the Venezuelan people have shown that dignity has no price. And that is why all the unilateral coercive measures have failed. And in the future, they are destined to continue failing spectacularly, not only for the good of Venezuela, but also given the accelerated erosion of the supremacist and arrogant spirit behind those who impose these illegal, cruel, inhuman, and genocidal measures. Every day that this policy continues against Venezuela, alternative capacity of economics, political, social, and cultural development of its people will be empowered and made a reality. For each measure which seeks to freeze an asset, a service, monetary value, or transaction, Venezuela will unleash a whole torrent of new opportunities. To demonstrate this, let me give you one example that suffices. At the moment of the blockade of the economic war against Venezuela, the nation was able to achieve a 95% index. Although there are continued challenges, this number has then been invested, and we now have 97% of food self-sufficiency and self-supply in our country, even though they tried to strip us of our supplies. Today, with our own efforts, the Venezuelan economy has begun a process of recovery with figures that are quite higher, much higher than other countries in the region, as set forth by ECLAC and other specialized bodies. Their data indicates this. Mr. President, on the 28th of July, Venezuela will hold presidential elections for the period 2025 to 2023. The electoral environment of peace and civic duty will lead to 11 candidates and 37 political parties in this election, which represents an ideological spectrum and national policy and is providing a great political public debate today in our country in the streets of Venezuela. The sanctions which were stimulated and supported by the political opposition, which are servile and directed by Washington, are at the center of this electoral debate. No doubt they will lose in the electoral failure, and there will be a failure of the attempt to impose on the Venezuelan people a colonial regime with fascist practices, which is absolutely anachronic given the Monroe Doctrine, which pretends to convert us into their back door. The sanctions and anti-democratic model, neoliberal model of Hungary, poverty, pain and suffering and coercion will be overcome once again and fail. And the Bolivarian principles of sovereignty and independence most likely will prevail in our elections, bringing President Maduro to yet another presidential term. The 28th of July, we will see a confirmation in our elections of a resounding democratic cry